I was researching 19th century architecture for a different project entirely when I noticed something in a photograph of the Philadelphia City Hall. The doorways, 12 feet tall, maybe 13. Ornate, yes, beautiful certainly. But practical, for whom? And once I noticed it there, I couldn't stop seeing it everywhere else. Boston, New York, London, Paris, Melbourne. Buildings cascading across my screen, each one revealing the same impossible proportions. Orphanages with 12-foot doors supposedly built for abandoned children who couldn't possibly open them. Floor-to-ceiling windows, furniture, desks, chairs, beds, proportioned for bodies that don't exist in our records. The pattern repeated across continents, across cultures, across what we're told were completely separate civilizations, with no contact, no shared building codes, no reason to build the same way. Yet there they were, the same impossibly large doors, the same towering windows, the same furniture designed for people who simply don't exist in our history books. This raises a simple but critical question. Who were they building for? Let's start with what we can measure, what we can photograph, what exists undeniably in our cities today. Grand Central Terminal in New York, windows 60 feet high, the Keleti railway station in Budapest, doorways you could drive a carriage through standing up, the Palacio de Correos in Mexico City, ceilings that dwarf anyone standing beneath them. For a post office, Melbourne's Flinders Street station, the Gare du Nord in Paris, Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus in Mumbai, railway stations, you might say. Public buildings meant to inspire awe. Fair enough. But what about the residential architecture? The apartment buildings of St. Petersburg with their 15-foot doorways. The townhouses in Boston's Back Bay with ground floor windows that begin 8 feet off the pavement. The ordinary commercial buildings across San Francisco, Chicago and Montreal, where the first floor alone has 20-foot ceilings. The official explanation is simple. It was the style of the era. The Beaux-Arts movement. Neoclassical revival, architectural ambition. But the official explanation collapses here. Style doesn't explain engineering necessity. You don't add 6 feet to every doorway and triple your glass and heating costs just for style. You don't excavate deeper foundations and create massive structural complications that make buildings exponentially more expensive simply because it looks nice. But, okay. Let's assume they did. If you've made it this far, you're probably thinking, old buildings are grand. So what? Here's what. The furniture matches. Across museums, look at the furniture catalogues from the 1800s. Not the miniature reproductions we have now, but the originals. Beds 8 feet long, chairs with seats 3 feet off the ground, dining tables where a modern person would struggle to reach their plate. Desks built for people who would have to be 7, 8, 9 feet tall to use them comfortably. Before you say, rich people liked big furniture, ask yourself, why? Why would you build a chair you'd need a step stool to sit in? Why would you commission a bed you'd rattle around in like a child? These weren't display pieces locked away in museums during their time. They were residential furniture. Furniture people used. And that's where the scale becomes impossible to ignore. Now we arrive at what kept me awake at night when I first started piecing this together. The buildings I'm describing weren't constructed over centuries as architectural knowledge slowly spread. They appeared in a remarkably compressed time frame, roughly 1850 to 1920, 70 years, during which we're told that cities across 6 continents separated by oceans and mountain ranges and political hostilities all independently decided to build structures with ceilings between 15 and 40 feet high, install doorways averaging 10 to 14 feet, use window proportions requiring glass panes up to 20 feet tall, incorporate ventilation systems suggesting much larger lung capacities, include stairways with risers too tall for modern building codes. All of this happened, we're told, organically. Different architects, different cultures, different empires, different motivations, but the same impossible scale. Let's be specific here. Let's talk about staircases, because staircases don't lie. Modern building codes specify a maximum riser height of 7.75 inches because human biomechanics don't vary much. Our legs are the length they are, our stride is what it is. Yet in buildings from this 70-year window, you'll find grand staircases with 12-inch risers, 14-inch risers, steps that require the average person to genuinely climb rather than walk. Not in every building, mind you, that's the strange part. You'll find normal staircases, servant staircases, back staircases, what we might call secondary access points. These have normal proportions, 7-inch risers, human-scaled doors, but the main staircases, the primary entrances, built for someone else. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, buildings with two scales of architecture. One for whoever the structure was ostensibly for, and one for whoever it was actually for. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is where the investigation turns from architectural curiosity to something darker, something stranger, something that makes the silence surrounding these buildings feel less like oversight and more like deliberate erasure. Because there are photographs, not many. Most have been dismissed as hoaxes, as carnival tricks, as fraudulent giant displays meant to draw crowds at county fairs and travelling exhibitions. But the dismissal comes too quickly, too uniformly, too completely. Let me show you what I mean. There's a photograph from the 1870s of a man named Captain Martin Van Buren Bates and his wife Anna Swan, 7 feet 11 inches and 7 feet 5 inches respectively, according to official records. There are numerous accounts, documented in newspaper articles from the 1800s, of giant skeletons being discovered during construction projects, mining operations and archaeological digs throughout North America. 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet, sometimes larger. The articles describe the discoveries in detail. Many of these accounts mention the skeletons being sent to institutions for study. And then, nothing. The Lovelock Cave discoveries in Nevada, 1911. Remains measuring between 8 and 10 feet, explained away, reburied, records gone quiet. There are dozens of these photographs from the mid to late 1800s. Dozens. Men and women standing 7, 8, 9 feet tall, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups, sometimes with normal-sized people for comparison, making the scale undeniable. And here's the strangest part. They're always dressed in ordinary clothes, not performing costumes, not sideshow attire, but standard Victorian-era fashion. Suits that fit, dresses with proper proportions, as if tailors regularly made clothes for people twice the average height, as if it was normal. The deeper I went into this research, the more I encountered a wall of absence. Not denial, not argument, just nothing. Medical records that should exist don't. Census data with height recordings gone. Photography studios that specialized in these portraits burned down with suspicious regularity. Museum collections that once held skeletal remains of unusually tall individuals quietly donated away to private collectors or lost in floods, fires, mysterious administrative errors. The Smithsonian particularly appears in these stories again and again, acquiring remains from mound excavations, accepting donations of skeletal material from frontier discoveries, all of it disappearing into collections that researchers can no longer access, can't confirm existed, can't trace through official records. Why? Not what happened to the bones, not when were they lost, not under which administration did the records disappear. No, why? If these were simply tall people, outliers, medical anomalies, pituitary cases, why the systematic removal from public knowledge? Why aren't there extensive medical studies from the era? The Victorians documented everything. They measured skulls, catalogued physical specimens, created vast archives of human biological variation. Yet for people consistently measuring 7+ feet tall, appearing in photographs across decades and continents, silence. The silence was deafening. Silence. Let's talk about what happened next, or rather what didn't happen. Around 1920, the construction of these impossibly scaled buildings stops. Just stops. We transition, abruptly, without any documented architectural movement or manifesto, to human-scaled construction. The Art Deco period begins, and suddenly buildings have 8-foot ceilings, 6.5-foot doorways, normal windows, the official explanation, economic efficiency. The Depression, changing tastes. But that doesn't explain the uniformity of the change. Architectural movements don't work like that. They evolve gradually. There are transition periods, experimental phases. You'd expect to see buildings from the 1920s and 30s with some of the old scale, some of the grand proportions, especially in wealthy areas where cost wasn't prohibitive. Instead, complete standardization to smaller dimensions, worldwide, simultaneously. As if the people those buildings were designed for simply weren't there anymore. And around the same time, 1890s through 1920s, those photographs of unusually tall individuals stop appearing. The travelling exhibitions close down. The medical documentation ceases. The newspaper accounts of giant skeletons discovered in mound excavations so common in the 1880s dry up completely by 1925. Not gradually, abruptly. This raises another simple but critical question. Did they die out? Were they killed? Did something happen between 1890 and 1920 that removed an entire subset of the human population from public life so completely that within a single generation we forgot they existed, or did we choose to forget? There's one more piece of evidence that haunts me. Building maintenance records from the early 20th century. Not the construction records, those are mostly gone or inaccessible, but the modification records. The receipts and invoices for alterations made to these grand structures as they were converted for modern use. Doorways lowered, false ceilings installed, window panes replaced with smaller units, staircases rebuilt with additional landings to reduce riser height. Thousands of buildings across dozens of cities, all modified in the same ways, all within the same 30-year window. The invoices exist, the contractors exist. The before and after photographs exist. What doesn't exist is any explanation for why these modifications were necessary. The documents simply describe the work. Lower doorway from 13 feet 4 inches to 7 feet 0 inches. Install drop ceiling to reduce room height. No explanation, no stated purpose. Just the quiet, systematic work of making buildings fit the people who inherited them. Because that's what it was, wasn't it? Inheritance. We didn't build these structures, we moved into them, we scaled them down, we made them fit, and then we wrote histories that explained how we built them, how they were always meant for people our size, how the grandeur was just aesthetic ambition. The evidence suggests something much larger. So, who were they? The photographs suggest people between 7 and 10 feet tall, not grotesque, not misshapen, not suffering from the pituitary gigantism that affects modern exceptionally tall individuals. Look at the photographs carefully, when you can find them. These people have proportionate features, normal facial structure, no signs of the joint problems, the cardiovascular issues, the shortened lifespans that characterize acromegaly. They look healthy. They look like they were supposed to be that size. And if the buildings are any indication, there were a lot of them. Not a handful of medical curiosities scattered across continents, but a population large enough to warrant entire cities built to their scale. Public buildings, residential architecture, furniture industries, tailoring establishments, infrastructure. You don't build infrastructure for anomalies, you build it for populations. The question becomes, what happened to that population? There are no mass graves, no documented plague, no war that specifically targeted the exceptionally tall. No explanation, in other words, for why a group large enough to necessitate continent-spanning architecture would completely disappear from historical record within 2 generations. Unless someone wanted them disappeared. Unless their existence contradicted a historical narrative someone was building. Unless the someone who inherited those buildings didn't want awkward questions about who built them first. The term Tartaria appears on maps from the 15th through 19th centuries. designating vast territories across Central Asia, Siberia, sometimes stretching into Eastern Europe. Official history tells us it was a catch-all term, a label for regions Europeans didn't fully understand. But those maps are remarkably detailed for regions supposedly unknown. They show cities, infrastructure, political boundaries, trade routes. And when you compare the architectural style of those mapped cities, when you can find photographs or drawings, the scale matches. The proportions match, the impossible grandeur matches. Then, around 1775, Tartaria begins disappearing from maps, not gradually, not as exploration revealed it to be something else, just gone, replaced with the current geopolitical divisions we know today. Russia, Mongolia, China, Kazakhstan, as if an entire civilization was reclassified out of existence. And here's what keeps me up at night: the timeline matches. Tartaria disappears from maps, 1775 to 1850. The great construction boom of impossibly scaled buildings, 1850 to 1920. The photographs of unusually tall individuals, 1850 to 1920. The systematic modification of those buildings to human scale, 1920 to 1950. The complete erasure of those individuals from medical and historical record, 1920 to present. What if we didn't build those cities? What if we inherited them? What if the great fires that destroyed so much of San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, London, and dozens of other cities in the late 1800s weren't accidents but something else entirely? What if we were covering our tracks? The strangest part of this entire investigation isn't the missing records or the modified buildings or even the vanished photographs. It's the silence. Try to discuss this in academic circles. Try to publish research on the anomalous proportions of 19th century architecture. Try to get access to the Smithsonian's archived skeletal collections from mound excavations. Doors close, emails go unanswered, appointments get cancelled, not with hostility, not with argument, just silence, as if there's nothing to discuss, as if the questions themselves are improper. Why? If this is all coincidence, all misinterpretation, all the product of overactive conspiracy theorizing, why not just explain it? Why not provide the architectural records that show these buildings were always meant for people our size? Why not produce the medical studies explaining the population of 7 to 10 foot individuals as a known genetic variation? The absence of explanation functions as its own answer. They don't explain because they can't. Not without raising more questions. Not without pulling threads that unravel the entire narrative of the Industrial Revolution, urban development, the settled history of human civilization. So they stay silent, and we're left with buildings that don't fit, doorways built for giants, photographs of people who shouldn't exist, and a civilization called Tartaria that appeared on maps for 4 centuries before being quietly erased. I've shown you the doors, the windows, the furniture, the photographs, the timeline, but I haven't answered the question that matters most. What else did we lose? If these buildings weren't built by us, they were built by someone with capabilities we can't fully explain. The engineering alone, the stone cutting, the precision, the sheer logistics of moving materials that massive, requires either technology we don't have record of, or a population whose physical capabilities exceeded our own. And if that population existed, if they built those structures, what else did they know? What was in the buildings that burned? What was in the libraries we're told were destroyed in accidental fires? What knowledge did those medical specimens contain that made someone decide they needed to disappear from public collections? We live in their cities. We walk through their doorways, modified to fit us but originally built for them. We look up at their ceilings, we stand dwarfed in their halls, and we call them our history. But what if they're not? What if we're just the inheritors, the people who moved in after? The civilization that wrote new histories to explain what we found, because the truth, that we didn't build any of this, was too destabilizing to admit. I started this investigation with a simple observation. The doorways don't fit. I'm ending it with a question that has no comfortable answer. Who were we taught to forget? Not why, not how, not when exactly, or under what circumstances, but who? Because somewhere in the gap between those towering doorways and our standardized 8-foot ceilings, between the photographs of 7-foot tall Victorians and the complete absence of such individuals today, between maps showing Tartaria and maps showing its absence, somewhere in that gap is a population that built infrastructure for themselves and then vanished so completely that we inherited their world and called it our own. The doors, remember, even if we don't. Look up next time you enter a building from that era. Really look. Measure the proportions. Ask yourself who could comfortably use that space without modification. Then ask yourself why we're not supposed to ask. The buildings are still there. The photographs exist if you know where to look. The evidence persists, scattered and suppressed, waiting for someone to assemble it into a pattern. And the pattern, once seen, cannot be unseen. Were Tartaria's inhabitants the giants our folklore remembers but our history denies? Were they wiped out, or did they simply fade as we moved in? The architectural evidence suggests we're living in their remains. The silence suggests we're not supposed to notice. The investigation continues. If you've seen something, an unusual photograph, a family story, an architectural detail that doesn't fit, document it, share it, before it disappears like everything else, because they want us to stop asking. And that's exactly why we can't.